In our headlines on this Thursday afternoon, December 14th, South Korea and the Netherlands agreed to set up a semiconductor alliance to allow for greater economic endeavors and a stronger security partnership amid a host of geopolitical concerns worldwide. Meanwhile, the US Federal Reserve is maintaining its interest rate within the range of 5.25% and 5.5% for its third session in a row in light of easing inflation. And back here on the local front, the value of car exports thus far this year have hit a fresh high, reaching well above $64 billion on the back of eco-friendly vehicles to the US market. President Yoon and Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte have put on paper their plans for a semiconductor alliance between the two countries. Our senior presidential office correspondent Oh Soo-young starts off.
South Korea and the Netherlands have agreed to build a semiconductor alliance and new strategic dialogue channels amid the conflation of global security and economic challenges. President Yoon and Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte on Wednesday shared the outcome of their bilateral talks at The Hague upon Yoon's state visit to the country. As the global race to develop the most advanced microchips continues to heat up, given the technology's implications on the nation's economic and military prowess, Yoon and Rutte committed to building value chains between their governments, firms and universities.
한국과 네덜란드 간의 반도체 동맹을 구축했다고 하는 것은 저희들이 반도체의 그 초격차를 유지하고 최첨단의 기술을 함께 구축해 나가기 위해서 저희들이 중요한 과학 기술적인 문제들에 대해서 함께 논의하고 해결하고 정보를 긴밀하게 공유한다는 그런 뜻입니다.
Officially adopting the term semiconductor alliance in their joint statement, the two sides agreed to establish a bilateral semiconductor dialogue for better industry support and policy coordination, and a semiconductor talent program to nurture professionals in the field. Also, they set out to promote more information exchanges between their governments and establish a new economic security dialogue, along with a biennial 2+2 dialogue for foreign affairs and industry officials at the ministerial level to cover all critical technologies.
This is expected to greatly contribute to strategic coordination in the areas of supply chain, economic security and export control, including semiconductors.
Identifying both traditional and emerging security challenges, the two sides also inked a deal to expand defence cooperation and continue cyber policy talks and advance global discussions on setting new norms on the military use of artificial intelligence. Further broadening the areas of cooperation, having upgraded their bilateral ties to a strategic partnership last year, the two governments inked MOUs on joint research and development in nuclear energy, carbon-free energy sources and ICT in the digital AI, quantum and cybersecurity sectors. Other major deals include building South Korea's first cold chain logistics hub in Europe, as well as R&D on neuroscience and smart agriculture and promoting cultural exchanges. Looking forward, the two leaders emphasised their shared values of liberal democracy and rule of law as the basis of their future partnership. In that regard, they reaffirmed their commitment to peace and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific region, which sees some 60% of the world's maritime trade pass through, and jointly condemned North Korea's nuclear and missile development. They also opposed the regime's arms exchange with Russia, while expressing their continued support for Ukraine amid Moscow's ongoing invasion. The President's office says South Korea will continue to bolster its security and economic resilience by expanding its network of like-minded countries, fostered by Yoon's active summit diplomacy this year. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News, The Hague.
And bilateral network expansion was also broadened to include the corporate arenas of the two countries at their first business forum in Amsterdam on Wednesday. Our Park Gonu has details.
The first business forum between South Korea and the Netherlands was held at an Amsterdam hotel on Wednesday local time, where the two nations agreed to strengthen cooperation, especially in the semiconductor industry. The forum took place during South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol's 4-day state visit to the Netherlands, with King Willem-Alexander, government officials, and 200 entrepreneurs from both countries, including CEOs of Samsung Electronics, SK Group, and ASML also present. ASML is a Dutch chip equipment supplier for South Korea's Samsung and SK, the world's largest memory chip makers. President Yoon began his keynote speech by addressing the relationship between both nations.
네덜란드는 60여 년 전에 한국이 유럽과의 무역을 본격화하기 위해 최초로 무역관을 개설한 국가입니다.
He added the two countries have been expanding cooperation, recording an all-time high trading volume last year, twice as much compared to the pre-pandemic era. And he said South Korea and the Netherlands should strengthen their cooperative relationship even more.
앞으로 양국 간 협력이 더욱 활성화되기 위해서는 반도체 분야의 전략적 연대를 더욱 공고히 다져야 합니다.
President Yoon also announced at the event that companies from the two nations will build a joint R&D center in Korea, provide opportunities for graduate school students to learn cutting-edge technologies together, as well as the establishment of chip dialogue channels between the two governments. He also said collaboration in the carbon-free energy sector, including nuclear, hydrogen, and offshore wind power, along with the logistics sector, will be expanded. On the sidelines of the forum, a total of 19 MOUs and agreements in cutting-edge technology, renewable energy, logistics, and agriculture were made between the governments and companies of both countries. Park Gun-woo, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, in a poignant reminder of shared values, President Yoon Suk-yeol earlier on Wednesday sought to honor the Dutch soldiers who fought alongside their South Korean counterparts during the Korean War. Our correspondent Kim Do-yeon has more.
At the Royal Palace of Amsterdam on Wednesday, President Yoon Suk-yeol met with around 20 Dutch Korean War veterans and members of their families. He also showed gratitude for the swift decision by the Netherlands to support the South during the Korean War.
우리 정부와 국민은 70여 년 전 공산 침략에 맞서 싸운 네덜란드 청년들이 흘린 피를 결코 잊지 않고 그러한 감사의 마음 위에 양국의 굳건한 연대가 지속되어 오고 있는 것입니다.
More than 5,000 Dutch soldiers were deployed to South Korea during the war and more than 120 died. They participated in a number of key battles, including in Inje, Gangwon province. President Yoon also took the opportunity to award a, quote, hero's uniform to a 93-year-old Dutch veteran. King Willem-Alexander also showed his appreciations to the war hero.
Just as our country received help from the United States, United Kingdom and Canadian forces during World War II, 5 years later you went to South Korea and fought for freedom. Even now, 70 years later, you are still receiving expressions of gratitude from South Korea.
The historical connection between South Korea and the Netherlands dates even further back. President Yoon, in fact, while at The Hague, visited the Ridderzaal, where the Second World Peace Conference was held in 1907.
President Yoon, together with Prime Minister Rutte, viewed exhibits related to the 1907 World Peace Conference and paid tribute to the patriotic spirit and noble cause of the national heroes.
Korean diplomats, led by Lee, were dispatched to the conference to speak up for Korea's sovereignty amid Imperial Japan's attempts to colonize the peninsula. However, the diplomats were not admitted to the conference due to rejection by Japan at the time. President Yoon is the first South Korean president to visit the site, and he explained to Prime Minister Rutte why the place has special meaning for Koreans. After the visit, President Yoon also paid a short visit to the Lee Peace Museum. There, the top office says President Yoon took a look at the room Lee stayed in while making efforts to spread the word about the unjust occupation by Japan. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Policymakers at the U.S. Federal Reserve have decided to keep their benchmark interest rates steady for the third session in a row. Our economics correspondent Shin Ha-young reports.
During the U.S. Fed's last meeting of this year, policymakers on the Federal Open Market Committee decided to maintain interest rates for the third consecutive time. With the Fed's latest move, the benchmark interest rates in the U.S. now stand in the range of 5.25% to 5.5%, marking a 22-year high. The decision is largely attributed to robust employment and a slowdown in inflation. The Consumer Price Index, a key gauge of inflation for last month, rose 3.1% on year, the lowest increase seen since June due to a drop in energy prices. Consumer prices have been slowing after hitting 9.1% in June of last year. On Wednesday, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell acknowledged that the current level is likely at its peak, but emphasized that it's far too early to declare victory.
While we believe that our policy rate is likely at or near its peak for this tightening cycle, the economy has surprised forecasters in many ways since the pandemic. Ongoing progress toward our 2% inflation objective is not assured.
According to the Fed, the interest rate is expected to tick down to 4.6% next year, hinting that the Fed may cut the rate by 1/4 of a percentage point 3 times in 2024. Following the Fed's announcement, U.S. stocks welcomed the news. The Dow Jones Industrial Average on Wednesday surged 1.4%, closing at a new record high. The S&P 500 rose by 1.37%, while the Nasdaq closed with a 1.38% gain. Meanwhile, the latest Fed rate freeze means the key interest rate gap between South Korea and the U.S. remains at 2 percentage points. One expert says the BOK needs a clear signal from the U.S. to consider rate cuts.
Bank of Korea may decide to cut the rates a bit earlier if they are sure that the U.S. will start cutting the rates. But again, because the Fed has not given a very clear signal on when they will start to lower the rates, it may take quite a while. If we see household debts increasing very quickly, then I don't think the Bank of Korea can afford to cut the rates, or at least not cut rates very quickly.
He added that considering the Fed's forecast of a 2.9% interest rate in 2026, the BOK may not be able to lower its rate in parallel with the U.S. pace. 신하영, Arirang News.
Over in the Middle East, Israel has made clear its commitment to its counter-offensive against Hamas, regardless of the international response. Our Isingje has the latest.
Earlier this week, the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly passed a non-binding resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. However, despite an international call to bring about an end to the armed conflict that has killed thousands of civilians, Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen says Israel will continue its war in Gaza with or without international support. According to a statement from his office, Israel's top envoy added that a ceasefire at the current stage is a gift to Hamas, and it will allow the militant group to return and threaten the lives of Israelis again. In its latest move to keep Israel in check, Washington says Israel must follow international humanitarian law and protect civilians, amid reports that the Israeli military has begun filling underground tunnels in the Gaza Strip with seawater to eradicate Hamas. The comments come as the Wall Street Journal reported that the Israeli military has been using seawater since last month as part of its efforts to destroy underground tunnels that serve as Hamas hideouts and means of transportation. The intention is to flood the tunnels to flush Hamas agents from underground to the surface, but there are concerns that the aftermath of this operation could cause humanitarian damage and have an adverse effect on groundwater, water purification facilities, and soil in the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh said Wednesday that any plan for a post-war Gaza that does not involve the militant group is delusional. In a televised speech, the militant group's leader said he was open to talks to end the armed conflict and put the Palestinian house in order both in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. He also called on Arab countries to use all available options to stop the armed conflict. 이승재, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, in Dubai, this year's Global Climate Summit has come to an end with the phrase transition away from fossil fuels on the final deal instead of the phrase phase out. Our Gangwon explains.
A historic climate deal. Nations at the COP28 Climate Summit in Dubai agreed on transitioning away from fossil fuels. It is a first for a UN climate conference to produce such a deal, though it still stops short of including a long-demanded call for a phase-out of oil, coal, and gas.
We have language on fossil fuel in our final agreement for the first time ever.
The final consensus came after COP28 was extended beyond its official closing time of midday Tuesday due to intense overnight negotiations over the key sticking point, whether the text should include a call to phase down or phase out fossil fuels. Along with the final text transitioning away, nations also agreed on commitments to triple the capacity of renewables and double energy efficiency by 2030. Other progress was made in adaptation and finance, including the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund to support countries most vulnerable to climate change. The UN and EU largely celebrated the deal as a milestone achievement in global climate action.
I think this is a global turning point. For the first time, the world is committing to transition away from fossil fuels. So this has the potential to be the beginning of a new era, the post-fossil era.
They are a climate action lifeline, not a finish line. Now all governments and businesses need to turn these pledges into real economy outcomes without delay.
The decision also satisfied oil producers like Saudi Arabia, who've been advocating reducing carbon emissions rather than fossil fuel phase out. But it left island countries that are facing the direct impact of climate change dissatisfied, as well as developing countries that raised issues of equal responsibility. 이경은, Arirang News.
In local news, exports of ICT products expanded over 7% on year in November to end a 16-month losing streak. According to Seoul Science Ministry, these exports amounted to some $17.8 billion last month, compared to $16.6 billion a year earlier. Semiconductor shipments drove up exports as they rose more than 10% on year to hit $9.6 billion. Also, Korea's ICT imports fell almost 11% on year in November to just above $11 billion, contributing to a trade surplus. And as mentioned earlier, on several occasions, K-automobiles, if you will, have been raking impressive profits this year amid greater exports of eco-friendly cars to the U.S. market. Our An Sung-jin covers the latest findings.
South Korea's automobile exports this year have hit a record high for the January to November period. According to the Trade Ministry, amid greater demand for eco-friendly cars, the value of exports reached $64.5 billion. In November alone, the value of exports saw the highest monthly figure ever, reaching $6.53 billion, which is some $30 million more than the previous record set in March. This record has been attributed to an increase in exports of high-value eco-friendly cars such as the EV9 to the North American market. Exports to that region saw an on-year increase of 51%, making it the biggest market for Korean vehicles, followed by the EU. For those vehicles that were affected by the Inflation Reduction Act, such as EVs, hydrogen vehicles, and plug-in hybrid cars, despite concerns, the number of vehicles exported was the highest ever for November. Some 134,000 Korean electric vehicles were exported to the U.S. in the year up to November, nearly twice last year's figure. As the number of vehicles produced from January to November was 3.88 million, it is nearly certain that this year will be the first time since 2018 that the number of vehicles produced in Korea exceeds 4 million. Han Sung-jin, Arirang News.
Now, in about 5 weeks, Korea's Gangwon province will play host to teenage athletes partaking in the 2024 Winter Youth Olympics. That being said, my colleague Song Yoo-jin covers the preparations thus far and more.
As we get ready for another thrilling year in sports, 2024 gets off to a thrilling start with the Winter Youth Olympics Gangwon 2024. The Youth Olympic Games is for teens aged between 15 and 18 years old. It's held every 4 years and has the same sports and disciplines as the regular Winter Olympics we're familiar with.
South Korea is the first country in Asia to host the Youth Winter Games and the only one on the continent to host the Summer, Winter and Youth Olympic Games. Around 19,000 athletes and staff from over 80 countries are set to take part in the event.
Young athletes will have a chance to compete on the same courses and venues that Olympians did a few years ago. You can't miss out on curling when talking about the Winter Olympics in Korea after Team Kim won Korea's first ever curling Olympic medal at the 2018 Pyeongchang Games. Korea's curlers are hoping to make history again.
We're determined to give our all at the game so that we can secure a gold medal at the exact venue where Team Kim, who are from the same hometown as us, clinched silver.
Adding a fresh twist to the games is ice hockey. On top of the traditional 6-team tournament, the Youth Olympics exclusively has a 3-on-3 tournament. Meanwhile, over in Pyeongchang County, the Alpensia Sliding Center has lowered the starting line for the luge so that the course is smoother and less steep for the safety of the young athletes. And at the nearby ski jumping center, it's not just about competing. The venue will also host a range of hands-on events for teenagers, from mini ski jumping to cross-country skiing tryouts. With little more than a month left, Gangwon province is making last-minute preparations so that teenagers, just like its slogan, can grow together. The Youth Olympic Games will kick off on January 19th and run until February 1st. 송유진, Arirang News, Pyeongchang.
Let's take a look at the latest news in the world now. In Ukraine, Russian missiles hit the capital Kyiv, injuring at least 53, with no reported deaths so far. The early Wednesday morning airstrike took place as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky left the US after seeking additional military support. At around 3 a.m. local time, 10 ballistic missiles launched from Russia were picked up by Kyiv's air defense system. The Ukrainian Air Force said that the Russian missiles were all intercepted, but the debris landed on residential areas, including a children's hospital. Kyiv has been constantly receiving drone attacks recently, and this was a third missile strike on the capital in the past week. Meanwhile, Zelensky is struggling to convince reluctant American lawmakers to pass a $61 billion military aid package for Ukraine. The American electric car maker Tesla is recalling more than 2 million cars in the US market after the US regulator found its driving assistance system, Autopilot, to be partially defective. This recall applies to any model with the Autopilot feature, which was launched in 2015, meaning it affects almost every Tesla car in the US. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's 2-year investigation has led to the conclusion that there may be potential misuse of the autopilot function, which may hinder the driver's safety. Tesla acknowledged that the current autopilot controls may not be sufficient to prevent driver misuse, potentially escalating crash risks. Tesla's owner, Elon Musk, has since announced that the issue will be fixed by a software update sent over the air. The 2024 Paris Olympics organizers have announced that 60% of food at the Games will be vegetarian options. On Tuesday, a sneak preview was released for the chefs involved to showcase some of the dishes, including a burger with patty made from wheat. The organizers said that they also aim to make 80% of all dishes from domestically sourced ingredients in an effort to reduce the Games' carbon footprint. A total of 13 million dishes are expected to be served at Paris 2024. Kim Xiang, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. The unusual December weather pattern continues with heavy winter rain. Rain that started in the west will spread nationwide by the afternoon with more than 120 millimeters in the east of Gangwon province. Meanwhile, the rest of the country could see up to 80 millimeters. And central parts of the country could see 10 to 20 millimeters an hour of heavy rainfall tomorrow. Concerns are rising for mountainous regions in Gangwon province, where already heavy snow has hit, and there could be more than 30 centimeters of snowfall with a preliminary snow advisory being issued there. So please stay safe and drive with care if you are near the area. Despite the precipitation, temperatures will stay above norms today. Seoul topping out at 9 degrees, Jeju at 19 degrees Celsius this afternoon. Then on and off precipitation continues through Saturday. Then mid-winter temperatures sweep much of Korea with frigid air. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
And on that note, we end Thursday's afternoon newscast. Thank you for watching, and do stay with us for our panel session coming up next.